Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar with Rachael Cristine Woody. My name is Bradley, and I will be your moderator for this webinar titled How to Build a Museum Paid Internship Program. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. Now, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Rachael Cristine Woody. Rachael is the owner of Relicura and provides services to museums, libraries, and archives. She specializes in museum collections management systems, digitization technology, digital project management, and digital usership. During the course of her career, she has successfully launched multiple digital projects that include advanced digitization technology, collaborative portals, and the migration of collection information into collections management systems. She is also a popular guest author for Lucidea's Think Clearly blog and has provided us with many great webinars that are listed on our website. So please feel free to check those out after today's session. Take it away, Rachael.
Well, thank you so much, Bradley, for the warm welcome. Thank you, Lucidea, for hosting us today, and thanks to you for joining us. This particular topic is near and dear to my heart, so I'm excited to cover it with you. We've got a full session planned. We're going to cover the criteria for who is an intern, why museum internships need to be paid, which can be information to use if you need to advocate for it within your museum. We'll cover how to build a meaningful internship experience because that is equally important to offering correct compensation. And speaking of compensation, we are going to talk about how to calculate how much you should pay an intern, and that will be helpful resources for you regardless of what sort of region you live in, what the minimum wage is, what the cost of living is, etc. And then perhaps importantly from the museum perspective, how to actually fund and financially format a museum paid internship program. So in addition to covering the importance and how to create a meaningful internship experience that is compensated, we'll also get into some of the more administrative strategy and logistics of how to actually do so. So first, just a quick disclaimer, because we are covering things such as how much to compensate someone, as well as when we talk about financial structuring, we'll want to make sure that you check in with your human resources department. And it's important for you to know that I am a museum professional. And while I do have knowledge and information and experience in this area, I myself am not a human resources representative, nor am I a professional in any sort of legal or tax specialties. So any laws specific to your state or region, as well as any policies specific to your organization, should be sought out and referenced when building your internship program. All right, criteria for who is an intern. This is important both in terms of understanding who are interns and how do we want to incorporate them into our museum, how do we put out the criteria for our internships, but it's also equally important to define internships as we start thinking about compensation, policies, and making ethical decisions for our program. So for example, when we're talking about interns, and especially for our field in the museum, interns are going to be professionals and they're going to be ones who've sought education typically in our chosen field. And because people can have second careers, they can come to the museum field as part of a later in life endeavor. It's important to remember that interns are not age dependent. They're not always going to be young adults, and that they could actually be any age, the primary definition just being that they're new to the profession. Also, in an undergraduate or graduate program or recently graduated. So part of the criteria for an internship is how close or proximate they are to having received their professional education. Interns are also new to the field and just starting to establish their career. So even if this is a second career and they may be older, If they've recently finished their program and this is them starting out new in the field, then they are definitely still considered part of an intern criteria. Interns also possess knowledge and skills for the field, and they just lack some of that real world application. So it's important to remember that when interns come to us, they come with knowledge and skills. They may be very new knowledge and skills, but they're still professionals. And this piece is important when we start thinking about compensation. And then finally, interns will likely have student loan debt. They may still be attending classes. They typically and statistically have shown that they hold at least one job, and they likely have familial care responsibilities. So this piece is important when we think about internship programs from an ethical perspective, and why it is so important to make sure that we are offering compensation, because these interns, their life circumstances and them in their timeline of being an intern, they will not necessarily have the privilege, just in terms of abundant time and resources, to do a museum internship for free. So we need to remember that as museum professionals offering internships, that these opportunities need to be offered in an equitable sense, knowing what the real life circumstances are for the majority of these new professionals. And to note, if a potential intern is not new to their career, like not new to the field, or they've not recently graduated, especially from a graduate program, then they are actually potential employees, not interns. So this is just to distinguish between, uh, for some museums who offer internships that end up going to people who are um, not recently graduated, who have had several years experience, and then being able to justify an internship level pay or no pay, whereas these people actually do not fit the criteria of being an intern, and really their criteria for being an employee. So again, an important distinction when we're thinking about both the ethics of a program as well as appropriate compensation. Okay, the case for why museum internships need to be paid. There are several reasons, and if you are at this particular webinar, you are probably already team compensation, but you may be in an organization where you are the one who's doing the advocacy for changing and evolving the museum internship program from one that was unpaid to hopefully one that is paid. So here's some talking points that you are likely already aware of, but could be helpful when you're doing that advocacy up. The first, and perhaps the heavy hitter here for boards or executive directors, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. We know from the work we've done these last few years on DEI that offering compensation and appropriate, accurate compensation is one of the pillars needed to support an equitable and inclusive environment, one that doesn't only make room for those who are privileged to accept the non-paid or lower paid jobs, and instead one where everyone can literally afford to participate in a paid internship. This also helps to increase representation within our field, which is another challenge that we are having as a field as a whole, and of course at the museum level, which is just one more area of DEI where paid internships could help. The second point, and one that we should all be behind, is that it creates a healthier field when everybody is being compensated and compensated appropriately. That is like a raise all ships for everyone. If we are at a museum and the interns are being compensated at an appropriate grade level, that should help ensure that then all the rest of the staff's compensation is equally appropriate. And if it's not, this is an opportunity to do advocacy for changing that. So having a healthier field, healthier museum. The next benefit is that it creates a better pipeline of talent. And for this particular benefit, yes, it could directly benefit the museum, but this one is more for the field as a whole. The more we're able to attract talent and compensate them appropriately, which is what attracts good talent, the more the pipeline of potential staff that we can hire later will be. So for the field in general, this is a great benefit. Having a good appropriate wage for the intern can help raise and have higher wages for everyone else. So, I touched on a little bit in the healthier field. This is one of the direct and very tangible results of once we start paying our interns and paying appropriately, we then have the evidence and ability to leverage that for our own wages. The next benefit is learning experiences for the new professionals. So, part of why internships are important and why so many people still do them, even if they're unpaid, is because having that hands on learning experience at the museum is really valuable. It still needs to be compensated, but it's such an important piece of how our field works as a profession. And for one of the final benefits listed here, it enhances an organization's capacity to execute projects. So while this could be true even if operating an unpaid internship program, having the paid internship attract better interns, like better caliber, because they can actually afford and be compensated with your internship, will actually help increase the capacity from even if you were using unpaid interns beforehand. So capacity for the organization can increase, and the quality of work being done with these interns can also be noticed as a tangible effect. So here's an example, the Northwest Archivist in Residence, and this is a program that I had a hand in co-creating, so I'm very familiar with all of the aspects, and in going through this experience is part of how I learned a lot of what we're presenting here today. So it's been tested, it's been implemented, and if you would like to see an example, we do have a link at the bottom of this slide. And for this particular program, we got it started in 2018, and it did take a year and a half about to like iron out and figure everything out in terms of how much the internship, how much should it be compensated? How do we account for, in this case, it's a regional internship with a couple different states. And each state has a different minimum wage, different cost of living, depending on urban or rural. So ironing out the, how do we figure out how much the intern should be paid, and having that sort of depend on both experience as well as location. We also had a time to define the eligibility criteria. So thinking about who is an intern, what criteria are we looking at? So some of the discussion we had earlier in this webinar. And then, of course, the application creation process and going through with a lens of centering the intern first in terms of what experience are they looking for? How does this build on their future career plans? Why did they pick this particular potential internship? So thinking through all of those logistically challenging, but also really fun to think about opportunities of how we were putting this program together. So if you'd like to see what the residents' experience is, there's a link to a blog post for each of the residents. Each year, we'll talk about their experiences during the internship, things they've learned, sharing the projects that they have done. And just a shout out to Lucidea, who have been supporting this program as one of the sponsors since its inception. So going on, I think it's 5th year. So thank you to Lucidea for helping support a healthier field. All right. When we think about you creating your own internship, we have some prompts for you to think through in terms of what can help make a meaningful internship experience. And if you've listened to some of the webinars I've given previously or have read some of the previous blog posts I've written, you will understand or remember that I am a huge advocate for interns doing professional level work and for learning new things. So really wanting to shift from please rehouse this object or please put a catalog number on this object to yes, maybe some of that work, but getting into like some heavier intellectual, deeper and more challenging projects to actually teach them new and real life type examples, tools, projects that we deal with every day in the museum. So how to make a meaningful internship experience. Here's a couple prompts. What can the intern work on that adds value to the collection while also providing value to their career experience? An internship can be mutually beneficial, but we want to make sure that the intern is getting something out of it as they look towards their future career. What experiences can the organization provide the intern that will make them a more competitive future applicant? So, one thing that's so important and why I love doing and hosting paid internships is that the experience can be so meaningful for the intern and their future work. And I want to make sure I'm doing everything I can to make sure that that new professional has the exposure to different aspects of the work, is able to attend committee meetings, is able to attend a professional conference under the auspices of the work they're doing for the museum. So giving them those competitive edges as they enter the workforce through this experience. Another prompt: what projects have supports in place where the intern can engage in active learning in a safe space? So having interns work on real life projects is an important piece of their learning experience, but they're new professionals. And if this is their first internship, this could be their first time actually working in a museum with a museum collection. So regardless of the type of project that is in place, there should definitely be time and space and safety for them to learn how to do that work, knowing that there will be some mistakes. So, going through training, making sure that they have the knowledge they need, that they have the confidence that they need to do the project correctly, but also having supports like maybe frequent review or additional hands-on training to make sure that if they do make mistakes, it's not going to hugely impact your work, but also that they can use that as a learning experience without fear of really messing stuff up. All right, so we talked about the prompts of how to create a meaningful internship experience, and now we're going to talk about some of the success markers. So, first marker of a successful internship is making sure that it's discrete and a start to finish project. So, we don't want an intern to come in and it's like halfway through a project that's already been done by somebody else. And we also don't want an intern to start a project, but then the internship's only 3 months, for example. We don't want the project lingering either. Having a discrete start to finish project will help the intern to feel like they've accomplished something. It will help make sure that they're successful at completing it. And it will also help you not to have any of these lingering, like half done projects. Another marker for success is producing a product or deliverable. So, because these are new professionals and they're building their portfolios, they're wanting to put outcomes and achievements on their resumes, they want to be able to talk about projects and things they've done in their interviews, giving them an experience where they can point to a product deliverable, point to and speak about the outcomes of their internship will help them be a successful new professional, as well as help you be able to point to and leverage, hey, we had this paid internship, they were amazing, they were able to produce this X product over here that we otherwise would not have been able to do. And it's great to show off to donors and granting agencies, especially if you are asking those donors or granting agencies for funding for paid internships. Another important marker for success is growing the intern as a professional. This is part of our responsibility as being the supervisor or mentor of this intern and giving them exposure to committee meetings, networking opportunities, all of the other aspects beyond just the project they're working on that are aspects of us being museum professionals. This is an important part of the exposure and part of the benefit of having an internship experience. Is the project, so the other marker for success is that it is a project that wouldn't otherwise be completed by paid staff. So we want to make sure that we're doing this in terms of setting the intern up for success, that it's a project that they are capable and have the capacity to do. But ethically, we also want to make sure that we are not assigning work to an intern that is more appropriate and should otherwise be done by a permanent paid employee. For example, we do not want an intern creating a collection development policy all on their own. They have never had experience doing that before, most likely, and it would not be appropriate for them as not a permanent employee of the museum. Instead, you may involve them in doing like a gap analysis or assessment of your current collection development policy and perhaps provide feedback and recommendations for an updated version, but you would not ask them to create this new version, and certainly not from scratch. And then finally is a project that supports learning and can absorb mistakes. So we want to make sure we're building a safe environment for the interns to be learning and doing new things. That's the entire point of having an internship, is being able to apply the knowledge they've received as part of their training and education and applying it in a museum setting. So making sure that there's plenty of training, that there's areas for them where they can make mistakes that are not going to adversely impact the work that you are doing or the museum too adversely. So creating that safe space, because there will be mistakes, that's a huge part of the internship experience. So a meaningful internship includes a dedicated supervisor. In order to construct that meaningful internship, in order to ensure the success markers of the internship are in place and that are achieved successfully, you need to be involved and dedicated for part of your time at least for this internship. Also, training and easily accessible instructions. These are new professionals and they are doing new things, and it is completely understandable for them to be nervous and perhaps a little overwhelmed. Part of how we can help them feel more confident and ensure that they're able to do the projects accurately is through great training and documentation that includes visuals, whether that's screenshots or pictures of the particular project that they're working on. Regular check-ins to make sure that the intern has what they need and that the project is progressing. For a lot of internships that have not worked out well, usually one of the main factors is because the supervisor was not as present or available, and that the supervisor was perhaps not as proactive to check in with the intern on a regular interval. It's important to remember that the interns, as new professionals, may not have the confidence to ask you all the questions that are in their head, and instead will need you to be more proactive in making sure that the questions they may have, they feel safe in asking, and that they have all the information that they need. Another item is a place to work with equipment and supplies. So if we are bringing people into our space to complete their internship projects, we need to make sure that they have an actual physical space to do the work. And if it's something with like the collections catalog or digitization, that they have the equipment that they need to perform that project in their space. And then finally, fair compensation based on market numbers and reflects the professional work being performed, which we're going to get into the details of in a moment, but it's important to remember that a meaningful and successful internship does include that accurate compensation component. What an internship should not include. So we had like a do's list, now we have a don'ts list. So the internship should not include staple pulling, rubber band removal, refiling, relabeling, endless scanning, tasks like that. It's okay if they include a little bit. That's a natural part of the work. But for that to be the entirety of the project, they're not learning anything if they're only doing these tasks. Also, work that is clearly for a permanent paid position. So we talked about how that was inappropriate from an ethical perspective, but also that that's inappropriate for you to use any sort of product like that that was created by a new professional when really it should have been by a seasoned permanent employee. Work that is beyond their current learning or abilities. So if you remember the collection development policy example we talked about, it is not reasonable for us to expect them to create a brand new collection development policy if they have never done so before. So wanting to make sure that we're scoping our projects, skills and knowledge that are required appropriately for a new professional. And then making program decisions, fundraising, performing outreach to the underinvited communities we work with, and other items that are inappropriate for an intern to engage in due to the temporary and not permanent employee status. To share a specific example, one of the grant reviews that I participated on, one of the projects suggested that the intern actually be the one to reach out to one of the local tribes, which would have been the first time there was any outreach done. And so knowing that there was not a relationship in place And knowing that the intern would only be there for 3 months, that they were not a permanent employee, just made it a completely inappropriate project for an intern to do, regardless of if it was paid or unpaid. All right, doing the math for appropriate compensation. There are a few different resources that you will want to check out that help give you some numbers to work with. The first one is the MIT Living Wage Calculator. That's going to give you an opportunity to plug in like city and state or province and find out what the living wage is compared to the minimum wage in that particular area. Then, and of course, after these last few years, having an understanding of the consumer price index. Inflation has been crazy, and therefore, cost of living has gone up more than the average used to be. And so, accounting for that, especially annually as you review compensation that you offer, is incredibly important. Next, firms with federal contracts, because they're federal, it means that you can find the pricing information for that contract online, and it can give you a helpful indication of what the market rate is for this type of work. Related, there are government pay schedules. So depending on if you're a museum or an archives or a library even, there are government job descriptions with the according pay scale depending on experience and knowledge, as well as taking into account location. So there's some great government resources that you can access that are also publicly available to help you with that market rate. Then there's the typical job boards, Bureau of Labor Statistics, salary surveys. Depending on what region or area of the field that you are in, you may have access to some of these different sources of statistics or demographics that can help inform that market rate. And then finally, if your organization has a transparent pay scale or schedule, it's helpful to have that in place and referenced as well, especially if the internship is being housed and funded by the museum. It should be in accordance with the current museum pay scales and keeping that in mind and taken into account for the rest of the other paid staff. So here are two examples. Example one is with Boise, Idaho, and example two, Seattle, Washington. And I'll walk you through each one. So looking at example one with Boise, the minimum wage for Boise, Idaho is the federal minimum wage, which is currently $7.25. When you look at the living wage, so checking out the MIT living wage calculator for Boise, Idaho, the living wage, people would need to make $16.57. So really what I recommend is using the living wage as like the floor, like the absolute lowest that you need to go up from to offer compensation for a professional and paid internship. For this particular example, we can pretend that this person has completed a master's degree and that they have 1 year of experience. So we know that they've completed the program, they have all of the knowledge they're going to get for that particular degree, and they've also had previous experience, so they're coming to us with that intact. And for this particular example, and because of the caliber of the intern we want to work with, the project requires technical expertise and independent work. So we're working with somebody who's got great knowledge, has some experience, and they're also going to work on a project that is technically complex and will require them to do work on their own and independently, even though there will still be a supervisor in place. So lower minimum wage and perhaps lower cost of living in this particular area, but we also want to factor in the caliber of the intern in terms of education and experience and the type of project that they're going to do. So in this case, the total hourly wage recommended is $21.50. That is us taking that floor of the $16.57, doing a bit of a market analysis with some of the other resources we mentioned in the previous slide, and determining that someone of this caliber working on this type of project should be making $21.50 an hour. To give you a comparison, example two is in Seattle, Washington. So Washington, the minimum wage is higher, $18.69. The living wage is also higher. This is one of the most expensive areas in the Pacific Northwest. So living wage is $21.48. So that is our floor for an internship in this area. For this particular example, this is a first-year graduate student with minimal experience. So they've not finished the master's degree or PhD yet, and they have minimal to no experience. And the project that we are having them work on, because they're a newbie, will require extensive oversight and mentorship. So knowing that they're coming in with minimal knowledge and experience, that the project is going to be fairly hands-on from the supervisor's perspective, and that it's very beginning level, we are going to recommend an hourly wage of $21.50. So you'll notice that it is the same amount. However, taking into account the different criteria, the math happens differently, of course. So looking at the living wage with the minimum wage, looking at the market rate for the area, comparing it with, okay, it's this person has this much knowledge and experience versus this person in this different area. There are multiple factors to consider when you're calculating the minimum wage. So other benefit considerations, compensation is incredibly important, yes, but as this is an internship and part of the goal is creating and developing these newer professionals, we want to make sure that we are offering everything possible for them to benefit. So thinking about professional development opportunities, perhaps that is attending a local conference or getting, perhaps there's a local meetup of museums, giving them exposure to that. Having networking opportunities is so important, and facilitating those both internally in the museum, but also externally. So with partner museums or perhaps museums that are partners but not geographically proximate. So whatever that looks like for you in your location, supporting the networking both inside and outside the museum. Thinking about professional presentation opportunities. So maybe it's a presentation to the museum at the end of the internship. Maybe it's a presentation at one of the local professional organizations. But thinking about and giving those opportunities and encouraging the intern to take those opportunities as part of the project. And finally, creating a report, poster, or paper on their internship project as part of the project scope. So again, when we're thinking about that discrete start to finish type of project for an intern, having that include the intern going through the process of summarizing the work that they've done, creating a little bit of a report. Maybe it's in a poster format. Maybe they want to submit a paper to one of the local professional orgs. All of those aspects of them putting like a little final capstone on their experience will help them sort of solidify it as a whole, but it'll also help them as they move forward, applying for new jobs and entering the field as one of our colleagues. So these benefits will help to center their experience, and it will help them grow as an intern and as a professional. Cost mitigation. So even though many of us would love to pay interns what they're worth and make sure they're compensated appropriately, that may not always be possible. And we want to make sure that even if we are offering appropriate compensation, that there's not hidden costs elsewhere that we've not taken into account. So when we are hosting and developing this paid internship program, one of the other elements we want to make sure we keep in mind is cost mitigation, being aware of what other costs are involved and how we can help as the program administrator help mitigate those for the intern. One of which is cost of living stipend, housing, and or room and board. This may be particularly helpful if your museum is in a region or place that is very far removed, hard to get to. So if the intern is having to geographically relocate for that particular time frame, if you are able to offer any sort of like cost of living stipend or providing and subsidizing room and board, all the better for helping to mitigate that cost to the intern. Another thing to consider is the transportation reimbursement or provisions. So even if the intern is living in the same city or location as the museum, knowing that there can be like parking fees and mileage and gas, which is very expensive for most of us in our locations, all of those can eat away at the wage that the intern might be making. And so offering, if there's like a bus pass that the museum has, for example, all of that can help mitigate the cost on the intern side. Also, if you're a museum, there's usually museum membership and discounts, both at your museum, but maybe also at partner museums or other cultural partners. So if those are in place as benefits, offering those to the intern as well can be cost mitigation, but also help encourage them to get to know the local network. And another creative way is meals provided. So maybe you can't facilitate all of their meals, but making sure that lunch is always provided for them when they're on site is another way to help mitigate the cost to the intern as they're going through this particular program. So thinking about ways to help benefit and neutralize cost is the goal. So the intern is not either having to pay for part of their compensation, which lowers what they're earning, or if it's an unpaid internship, it means they're actually going into debt to do the internship because they are still having to pay for these things. So a note on cost mitigation, the intern should not incur debt in order to access the internship. So this means no school credit in lieu of pay, which is like a default for us for decades, and no unpaid or underpaid work, no expectation for them to relocate, no expectation that they cover room and board if they do relocate for the duration of the internship. So these are all things that have been traditionally in place for us at museums and are things that are just ethically no longer, well, they were never appropriate, but definitely now no longer appropriate, and are things that we need to remove and account for in our internship programs. Strategies for funding a paid internship program. So yes, we would love to pay our interns. I think we're all behind that concept for the most part, but how do you fund it? I mean, it's critical for every museum. We want to do a new project. How are we funding it? So first and foremost, operating budget. As paid internships are a demonstration of the museum's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, they should very much be accounted for in the annual budget. They should have a line in the annual budget. For some museums, that may take a few years and discussion and advocacy work. So I realize that just putting a museum paid internship on the budget isn't as easy as doing it tomorrow. With that in mind, thinking about fundraising. So doing a fundraiser, especially because internships are usually shorter term. And once we figured out compensation, internships, depending on all of the factors we've covered and length, could be as low as like $5,000 for the totality of that particular intern, and can be more doable for low-key and perhaps more informal fundraiser type projects. Company sponsors is another thing to think about. If you think back to the Northwest Archivist in Residence program, both my company and Lucidea are company sponsors of that particular paid internship program. And often companies that are adjacent to the museum industry have, of course, a vested interest in making sure that the museum is as healthy as possible, that the field is as healthy as possible. So you may find that you can partner with sponsors in your area and have them listed as supporters of the program. And then, of course, the tried and true donors and grants to consider. Both of these categories usually find paid internships very attractive. It's very much an element of like, we want to support the kids, we want to support students. And I say kids, even knowing that, again, an intern has no specific age, but knowing that they're nurturing like the next generation or next incoming wave of new professionals is incredibly attractive. So knowing that and using that when we are approaching donors and when we're approaching grant applications, how we can carve out and identify areas where a paid internship could be supported by their efforts and their support. How programs can be financially formatted. So we've talked about how to create a meaningful internship. We've talked about how to calculate how much to pay the intern, and even how we could do some fundraising for it. So now we're entering sort of this last piece of how do we even put this together? And this is especially helpful if your museum does not have a paid internship program in place just yet. So things to think about. And even if you do have a paid internship program in place, these may be helpful things to reflect on. Make sure you have all your ducks in a row. So financially formatted, there are three different ways you can go. And as we cover each one, you'll see which one is typically the most statistically used. But in summary, it could be employment, albeit temporary. It could be as an award or stipend, and it could be as a contract position. So employment makes sense for doing a paid internship if you're a for-profit organization. It typically, just due to the structure and setup and company culture, is typically easier, especially if it is temporary employment for the intern. And the internship, if it's intended to last 12 months or longer, for some circumstances, it may make sense to have an intern for 12 months. And so thinking about doing it as still temporary, but as a permanent employee can make more sense for your museum if that's the case. The implications of structuring it as employment versus award or versus contract is that employees who meet certain criteria are entitled to certain benefits, including unemployment. So depending on where you live, what the country or state laws are, as well as what policies may be in place for your museum, even as a nonprofit, there are certain triggers that may happen if that intern as an employee hits certain criteria. And the employer and employee taxes will come out of the amount paid. So as any traditionally employed person, we pay taxes, and our museum/company is paying taxes, and those taxes are applicable, of course, to the intern if they are also classified as an employee. Now, awards make sense if you're a nonprofit organization, and in fact, this is, at least in the United States, only available to those who are nonprofit organizations. If the internship is intended to last 12 months or fewer, so this tends to make more sense if it's more classified as short term, and you're able to solicit applications and award on a quote, an objective or non-discriminatory basis, end quote. And this is where the award's purpose is to achieve an objective. The reason why there's a quote in here is because this is the definition used by the Internal Revenue Service of the United States, where instead of traditional pay, compensating the intern via award is defined differently with the IRS tax code and has some beneficial implications. Speaking of implications, so for the award, an award is given, it isn't earned in a traditional clock the hours sense. So while you still may want your intern to track their hours, come in at specific days and times, they don't have to, in terms of the award, actually clock hours. It's based on, did they reach that end objective? It's recommended that you create program criteria and an evaluation rubric in order to meet your IRS or whoever tax department or agency's regulations. So knowing that it is an award, you need to make sure you're meeting certain criteria as defined. The internship isn't subjective to employee benefits and to some extent policies. So you'll still want to check in with your human resources representative here. But if the person is not traditionally employed, then there's usually no risk of hitting other criteria that would trigger other, like must offer health benefits, for example. The organization must issue in the United States a 1099 at the end of the calendar year. So even though it is an award, we are essentially paying the person as if they were a contractor, and we would issue a 1099 stating we paid this person this much for tax purposes. Speaking of tax, because it is an award and defined as an award differently in the IRS, for example, less taxes are taken out so that the awardee, the intern, is actually able to retain more of that money. So there's definitely the tax benefits for both you as not an employer, but as well as the intern. Contracts. So contracts make sense if the internship is intended to last a minimum of 6 months. And this is where we start considering it perhaps more term or temporary, not quite employment. And you don't want to hire an employee. You don't want the permanent commitment to the employee, but you also don't meet IRS criteria for an award, providing the award versus contract. The implications of a contract are the organization will likely need to go through a request for a proposal or a bid type process, and you may not receive bids from the persons that you are looking for a paid internship experience. Also, the contractor isn't subject to employee benefits and to some extent policies. This absolutely depends on your location, applicable regional and state laws, as well as any policies you might have. The organization must issue a 1099 at the end of the calendar year. So you are paying a contractor essentially, and you need to, just like with the award, and actually just as if they were an employee, the amount of what you paid so that they can do their taxes appropriately. And then the contractor, the intern, is responsible for all taxes, which means you need to compensate them even more than you would an employee because they have to pay that much more taxes out of the contracted amount that you've given them. So there's some financial considerations, and when we're thinking about cost mitigation for the employee, excuse me, not employee, for the intern. All right, some resources for you. These first three are great in terms of understanding the impact of unpaid internships. That can be greatly beneficial to you if you need to make the case to your museum in terms of why you should be offering paid internship programs. And to continue this, and especially getting into some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion aspects of needing paid internships, we have a couple more resources for you to check out and perhaps share broadly with your museum as you start your advocacy work in this area. Resources for the archivist in residence. So if you're interested in that type of program, even if you're not a regional organization, a lot of the framework and structure you can use is very similar. So you can check out, there's an end of residency report to see what type of internships have been constructed, how they were made meaningful, and examples of start to finish discrete projects. You can also check out the program in general, the archivist in residence, and there is a Q&A, a question and answer on how and why the program was formed the way it was. So you can check out that blog post for all the answers. Speaking of the Internal Revenue Service, checking out the definition of a common law employee as well as grants to individuals, that was the award one. So checking those definitions, making sure you're referencing them depending on which way you go. And of course, calculating pay. So these are all of the links to the resources you'll need to start gathering for like the minimum and living wage, as well as some of the market rates. And checking out the government pay schedules and pay tables will help you construct for your location and for your experiences and defined roles, compensation for the intern. But these are also incredibly helpful if you would like to consider your own compensation and advocating for your own worth. So, in conclusion, we've covered quite a bit, but we have now gone through a criteria for who is an intern. So, really understanding from an ethical perspective as well as from a logistics perspective who we are speaking about when we're speaking about interns. We covered why museum internships need to be paid. So, giving you some talking points to work with that you can pair with those resources if you need to do any advocacy within your museum. We also discussed how to build a meaningful internship experience. So what that looks like, what are some prompts to think about as you create those. We then went into how much you should pay a museum intern. So getting into where the resources are to find numbers and then what you do with those numbers. We also talked about how to fund and then financially format a museum paid internship program. So giving you ideas for where to go for that funding, as well as how you may actually administratively implement this internship program and execute it within your museum. And then, of course, all of the great resources. Speaking of, the most recent Lucidea Press collaboration that I've done with Lucidea is Prepare for Takeoff, Get Your Museum Digital Project Off the Ground. And so this particular book can be helpful for any of the digital projects you may be working on. And there may also be some great ideas in here for how to structure some projects that interns could help you on. So definitely check it out if you haven't grabbed your free e-copy already. And with that, I will turn it back over to Bradley.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful presentation. And if you'd like to learn more about our museum collections management system called Argus, please feel free to visit our website or reach out to us at sales@lucidea.com, and we'd be happy to have a chat with you. And if you have any more questions on any of our software or our company, our contact details are listed on the screen. Please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to this series. And on behalf of the whole Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending, and until next time, thank you.